Our story begins in the final decades of the 19th century, in the era Americans would later call the Gilded Age. It was a time when the raw frontier of the West was being closed and tamed, and the frontier of wealth, industry, and social ambition was opening in America's great cities. Steel, oil, and railroads created fortunes at breathtaking speed. Names like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller became symbols of power. Their families built palaces along Fifth Avenue, Newport, and Boston's Back Bay, decorated with crystal chandeliers, imported marble, and gilded mirrors that reflected the excess of an age. But within this world of astonishing opulence, there was another frontier, an invisible boundary between old aristocracy and new money, between restraint and indulgence, between sanity and madness. It is there that our story unfolds. Our heroine was born into privilege, the cherished daughter of a family tied to banking and shipping wealth. From childhood, she moved in the highest circles of society. In her youth, she was celebrated for her beauty, refinement, and wit. At glittering soirees, she shone like a diamond beneath the chandeliers, her gown sewn in Paris, her gloves fitted perfectly to her slender hands. Newspapers called her one of the most eligible young women of the season, and society matrons whispered that her life would be a fairy tale of wealth, marriage, and admiration. But the Gilded Age was not only a golden dream. It was also a dangerous tightrope where fortunes could vanish in a stock market crash, where reputations could be destroyed by scandal, and where women, no matter their wealth, were often trapped by the expectations of society. Her marriage was arranged not only for love but also for prestige. She was wed to a man of equal status, a figure who carried himself like royalty, admired in the press and envied by his peers. Their union seemed perfect, a storybook match that promised security, grandeur, and influence. Together they became the centerpiece of lavish gatherings. Their names appeared in the society pages, their photographs adorned magazines, and their home became a palace of entertainment. Yet behind the polished facade, cracks were forming. The pressures of the Gilded Age frontier were relentless. Every ball gown, every carriage ride, every public appearance was judged. To falter in etiquette, to lose money in a risky venture, to show even the faintest trace of scandal, these could spell ruin in a world where appearances meant everything. And so she pressed forward, smiling, dazzling, determined to remain the reigning star of her social world. But fate had other plans. As the seasons passed, whispers began to circulate. Some said her husband was reckless with money. Others suggested his faithfulness was questionable. And still others murmured that she herself was prone to melancholy, to sleepless nights, to fits of nervousness that no physician's tonic could cure. The truth, hidden beneath silk and pearls, was that her mind was slowly fraying. In the Gilded Age, mental illness was little understood and often shrouded in shame. Doctors spoke of hysteria, nervous disorders, and female weakness. Wealthy families, who could not bear scandal, often concealed their afflicted loved ones in private asylums, behind locked doors and shuttered windows. But for now, in these glittering early years, no one dared to believe she would become one of them. She was still the darling of the ballroom, still a vision of youth and beauty. The gaslights glowed, the orchestra played, and she glided across polished dance floors as though tragedy could never touch her. Yet history teaches us that the frontier is always shifting. For America, it was shifting from wilderness to industrial might. For the Gilded Age elite, it shifted from dizzying heights of wealth to sudden plunges of ruin. And for our heroine, it shifted from brilliance to darkness, from glittering triumph to tragic decline. This, then, is where our story begins, in the dazzling glow of the Gilded Age, at the height of its grandeur, with a socialite who seemed destined for greatness, but who would, in the end, lose everything to madness. The Gilded Age was a time when America seemed to stand at the edge of a new frontier. But unlike the wild frontiers of the West, filled with cowboys and gold-rush dreams, this was a frontier defined by money. In the late 19th century, to be rich was to be untouchable, to live like royalty in a republic that claimed it had no kings and no queens. Yet make no mistake, their palaces stood in plain sight. Fifth Avenue in New York became a golden boulevard, where mansions rose like fortresses of privilege. And in Newport, Rhode Island, great estates overlooked the Atlantic, shimmering playgrounds where the rich hosted summer balls and glittering garden parties. Into this gilded kingdom, our socialite stepped, young, radiant, and destined to be adored. She made her debut in society under gaslit chandeliers, her gown shipped directly from Paris, her diamonds catching every flicker of light as though they themselves were aflame. The newspapers adored her. Photographers captured her at every gala. At each gathering, whispers circled, "She is the darling of the age." But as history so often warns us, behind every glittering curtain, cracks began to form. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? To the world, she had everything: wealth, beauty, charm, and a name spoken with reverence in New York's drawing rooms. But privilege carries its own burden, and beneath the silks and jewels lived a soul trembling with shadows. In the gilded drawing rooms, where champagne flowed endlessly, silence often followed her footsteps home. Her family expected her to be perfect, the newspapers demanded she remain dazzling, and society itself offered her no escape from its rigid, merciless gaze. In this gilded frontier, wealth was power. Yet wealth was also a prison. The men of her world built fortunes on railroads, steel, oil, and speculation. They competed to see who could outspend the other, who could raise ceilings higher, who could build staircases grander, who could dazzle with the most extravagant costume ball. And she, our socialite, was placed at the very center of this competition, not as a rival, but as a jewel, an ornament, a symbol of prestige. To be adored was not the same as being free. Slowly, the cracks grew wider. Her laughter, once effortless, began to sound forced. The long nights of dancing left her drained. The endless whispers about who she might marry, which fortune she would unite with, turned her heart heavy. And in the shadows, a silence deeper than gold began to take root. Madness, in those days, was a word society feared and whispered about, but never confronted. For a woman of her station, even the slightest sign of distress was considered scandal. As years passed, her sparkle began to fade. Friends noticed she rarely appeared at gatherings. Journalists who once celebrated her beauty began to murmur about her absence. And when she did appear, her smile no longer reached her eyes. The woman who had once embodied the triumph of the Gilded Age now stood at its edge, unraveling. The tragedy was not that she lacked wealth, or status, or admiration. The tragedy was that all of those things had consumed her. The very frontier of wealth that had elevated her also destroyed her. Her life became a warning that riches cannot shield the human mind from despair, nor can chandeliers light the darkness within a heart. In the end, the darling of the Gilded Age was remembered not for her gowns, nor for her jewels, but for her fall. She was a star that shone too brightly in a sky that never allowed her rest. And when her mind gave way, when her world collapsed, society, so quick to adore, was just as quick to turn its face away. This is the frontier few spoke of. Not the frontier of land, not the frontier of conquest, but the frontier of wealth, where power came at a price few could truly bear. Our socialite story was not merely her own, it was the mirror of an era gilded in gold but hollow beneath the shine. The Gilded Age was a time of extraordinary wealth and breathtaking contradictions. Towering mansions rose along Fifth Avenue, their marble facades glittering like palaces of new royalty. The railroads carved lines of steel across a growing nation, while steel mills belched fire and fortune for those bold enough to seize opportunity. In this dazzling world of excess, socialites became the shining stars, icons of fashion, refinement, and prestige. Our heroine was one of them. Born into privilege, her name was whispered with admiration at dinner parties and inscribed in society columns. She was beautiful, elegant, and most importantly, available. For in the world of the Gilded Age, the destiny of women like her was rarely of their own making. Tradition dictated that her future was tied not to adventure or personal ambition, but to marriage. Suitors lined up at her door, each one richer, more powerful, more ambitious than the last. They came bearing promises of fortunes that stretched across oceans, railroads that linked cities, and steel that built the very bones of America's rise. To them, she was more than a woman. She was the key to alliances, the crown jewel that could elevate a family name into eternal recognition. After months of whispers, dances, and carefully orchestrated introductions, she chose, or perhaps was chosen. Her husband was a titan of industry, a man whose empire spanned railroads, steel, and shipping. Together, they embodied the promise of the Gilded Age dream: wealth, power, and influence. Newspapers praised them as the ideal couple, and their wedding was described as a union of fortune and destiny. But in high society, love was fragile. Too often it was built not on shared affection, but on financial alliances and social strategy. Their union glittered in the eyes of the public, yet inside the gilded walls of their mansion, loneliness crept in like a silent intruder. By day, she attended luncheons, charity balls, and extravagant soirees, her gowns imported from Paris, her jewels sparkling beneath chandeliers. By night, however, she walked alone through endless corridors of marble and gilt, her footsteps echoing against silence. Her husband's heart belonged not to romance but to business, and she found herself competing not with another woman, but with the ever-expanding empire of railroads and steel. The frontier she faced was not the rugged wilderness of the American West, but something far more intimate and treacherous, the frontier of love and marriage in a world where women's desires were rarely considered. She wanted passion, companionship, and understanding. What she received was duty, appearances, and a gilded cage. As the years passed, the cracks in their golden facade widened. She began to feel trapped, powerless in a world that demanded she smile for the cameras and host the balls, even as her heart quietly fractured. Loneliness deepened into sorrow, and sorrow twisted into despair. Gossip began to circulate. She was seen less often in society, her once radiant presence dimming into shadow. Behind closed doors, whispers of her nervous condition spread, a cruel label often used in that era to describe women whose spirits had been broken by lives not their own. In truth, she was losing a battle against the silence, against a marriage built on duty rather than love. Her story was no longer one of triumph and beauty. It was a descent into isolation, a tragic unraveling of a woman who had once been the very embodiment of Gilded Age splendor. Her downfall was not sudden but slow, a series of nights spent awake in a cavernous room, a series of mornings where the sparkle of her jewels could not hide the dimness in her eyes. She had everything: wealth beyond imagination, a name carved into society's golden ledger, a life that seemed perfect to those on the outside. But inside, she was unraveling, caught between the demands of tradition and the quiet cry of her own soul. The frontier of love and marriage proved more dangerous than any battlefield or wilderness. It was a war fought in silence, with no weapons but loneliness and despair. And for her, it ended in tragedy, a story of a woman who had the world at her feet, yet lost everything to the cruelest enemy of all, madness. Her tale reminds us that the Gilded Age, for all its brilliance and grandeur, was not made of gold but of fragile illusions. Behind the glittering facades of mansions and jewels were lives marked by sorrow, by silence, and by stories like hers. Stories of women trapped at the frontier of love, longing for freedom in a world that denied it. The Gilded Age was a time of dazzling wealth and ruthless ambition, where fortunes were built in railroads, steel, oil, and banking. It was a period when America's frontier spirit had not vanished. It had simply shifted. No longer pushing across prairies and mountains, the frontier was now one of power, influence, and opulence. And in this glittering age of excess stood one woman who embodied it all, a socialite whose rise seemed unstoppable, until tragedy and madness consumed everything she held dear. Her story began in an era when the American dream was being rewritten. The frontier of the 19th century had forged men of steel and women of resilience. But by the late 1800s, a new frontier emerged, the drawing rooms of New York, Newport, and Washington. Here, wealth was not just measured in gold but in influence, reputation, and the grandeur of one's estate. Our socialite entered this world not merely as a participant, but as a queen in her own right. She married into one of the great fortunes of the age, and with her husband's power and her own charisma, they quickly became the darlings of high society. Their mansion was a palace of modernity, adorned with marble halls, French tapestries, Venetian chandeliers, and every luxury Europe could export. Electricity lit their evenings, while telephones connected them instantly to the powerful. To step into their estate was to witness the triumph of the modern American aristocracy. But wealth alone was never enough. They sought influence. Their galas were not just evenings of music and champagne, they were political theaters. Senators, congressmen, industrial titans, and European nobles all passed through their gilded doors. Deals were whispered between dances, alliances sealed over glasses of French wine. They entertained royalty and rivaled the old dynasties of Europe, as if America itself was proving that its new elite could stand shoulder to shoulder with kings and queens. And yet, the frontier spirit of endless expansion carried a hidden danger. The higher one climbed, the more precarious the fall. Behind the chandeliers and silks, shadows began to stir. Whispers circulated about reckless spending, strained finances, and political enemies eager to see them ruined. The socialite, once admired for her wit and charm, began to feel the crushing weight of expectation. Each gala had to outshine the last. Each season demanded greater displays of wealth. What had begun as triumph slowly twisted into obsession. Her mind, once sharp and commanding, began to fray under the strain. Nights grew restless, her journals filled with paranoid notes and frantic sketches. Friends noticed her silences during dinners, her sudden bursts of anger, her laughter that turned too quickly into tears. Still, she pressed forward, determined to keep her crown as society's reigning queen. But the world she had built on ambition and spectacle was already collapsing beneath her. Financial disaster struck like a storm. Investments soured, political allies abandoned them, and creditors closed in. The estate, that once symbolized their triumph became a gilded cage of debts and despair. Her husband withdrew, consumed by his own failures, while she, once the radiant hostess of the age, was left battling the demons in her own mind. In the end, madness claimed her more surely than ruin. Her once proud figure was now a ghost wandering through empty halls, speaking to portraits, clutching faded gowns, as if they still carried the applause of 1,000 guests. The society that once adored her turned away, eager to embrace the next glittering sensation. The world moved on, as the Gilded Age always did, consuming its idols and discarding them in silence. Her story is more than just the tale of a fallen socialite. It is a reflection of the age itself. The Gilded Age promised boundless opportunity, just as the frontier once did. But beneath the gold leaf was fragility. Beneath the excess was despair. For every empire built, another crumbled. And for every queen of society who rose to dazzling heights, there was always the risk of a fall so deep it ended not in scandal, but in tragedy. The frontier of power and wealth was no gentler than the frontier of wilderness. It demanded sacrifice, it devoured the weak, and even the strongest could lose everything, not just fortunes, not just status, but their very sanity. And so the socialite story endures, not as a triumph, but as a warning that the pursuit of endless ambition, like the push into the frontier, carries a price. And sometimes that price is everything. The Gilded Age was a time of glittering wealth, towering mansions, and opulence so dazzling that it blinded society to the fractures forming beneath its golden surface. America was expanding westward, conquering the frontier, building railroads, and forging steel empires. It was an age of invention, ambition, and ruthless competition. But it was also an age of deep inequality, corruption, and restless speculation. Into this world of velvet curtains and diamond chandeliers was born a woman who seemed destined to shine. She was the very embodiment of Gilded Age glamour, an heiress with taste, wit, and beauty. When she entered a ballroom, conversation would falter, and heads would turn. Every newspaper columnist described her gowns. Every portrait painter begged to capture her likeness. To the public, she was not merely a socialite, she was a queen of society. But what society loved most was not stability, it was spectacle. And soon, the whispers began. They said she spent too much, that her soirees cost more than some men's entire fortunes, that her jewels sparkled brighter than any queen's. They said she was reckless, driven by vanity, a woman who built her identity on the fragile foundation of applause. In the salons and parlors of New York, people whispered of unpaid bills, of creditors who knocked too quietly on gilded doors, of a husband whose empire was not nearly as stable as it appeared. Her husband had risen with the industrial titans of the age, a man of bold ventures and risky investments. He built railroads where others saw wilderness. He bought steel when others feared collapse. But fortune in the Gilded Age was fickle. Empires built on loans and speculation could vanish overnight. And as his luck faltered, so too did hers. At first, the newspapers ignored the rumors. But then, like blood in the water, the story spread. Columns that once praised her gowns now hinted at scandal. Headlines that once called her society's brightest jewel began to suggest her brilliance was fading. Her name became a weapon of gossip. In gilded parlors and smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs, her story was told not with admiration, but with suspicion. The parties grew quieter. Invitations arrived less often. Once, she had been the center of every circle, but now she stood at the edges, smiling too brightly, trying too hard to prove nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Debt began to consume her household. The carriages that once lined her mansion now stood idle. The servants whispered of unpaid wages, of furniture disappearing piece by piece, sold discreetly to cover losses. She fought to hold on to her image, but the mask was cracking. And then came the final blow. Her husband's empire collapsed under the weight of loans he could not repay. Businesses closed. Investors demanded restitution. The fortune that had built her world was gone, swept away in the ruthless tide of speculation that had made and unmade so many during the Gilded Age. Society, ever hungry for drama, turned its back. The same people who once bowed before her now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Friends disappeared. Allies abandoned her. She had become a parable whispered in drawing rooms, proof that wealth without wisdom was nothing but glittering dust. Alone, shunned, and stripped of her fortune, she began to unravel. Her mind, once so sharp and commanding, was consumed by despair. The mirrors in her once bright ballroom reflected not a queen of society, but a woman haunted by what she had lost. She spoke to portraits as though they were alive, wandered through empty halls still hearing the echoes of orchestras that no longer played. The city that once adored her now treated her as a cautionary tale. To some, she was a victim of her husband's reckless ambition. To others, she was the architect of her own destruction. But behind the whispers and rumors was a far more tragic truth. She was a woman crushed by a society that loved to worship, but loved even more to destroy. Her story reminds us of the Gilded Age itself, an era where fortunes rose like empires and collapsed like fragile towers, where beauty and brilliance could mask fragility, and where the line between admiration and scandal was as thin as the silk gowns worn in candlelit ballrooms. Season 5 of her life, the season of whispers in the parlors, was the most devastating of all. For it was in this season that she lost not only her fortune and her status, but also her mind. And in the end, what society remembered was not the glitter, but the fall. This was the tragedy of the Gilded Age socialite who lost everything to madness. The story of the Gilded Age is often told as a triumph of ambition, wealth, and progress. But behind the glitter of diamonds and chandeliers, there are darker truths, stories of fortunes lost, families destroyed, and lives broken beyond repair. This is the tragic story of a socialite who rose to dazzling heights, only to fall into the abyss of madness when everything she cherished was torn away. The dawn of the 20th century should have been her golden era. She had everything that defined the Gilded Age: a sprawling mansion built in marble and gilded wood, gowns imported from Paris, and evenings spent under crystal chandeliers, while orchestras played waltzes in her grand ballroom. To New York society, she was the epitome of elegance and success. Her husband's empire, built on railroads and steel, stretched across the continent. Together, they were symbols of power in an age when America believed its prosperity would never end. But history is never so kind. The financial crash arrived like a storm no one saw coming. Banks closed their doors. Railroad companies, once titans of industry, collapsed into bankruptcy. Stocks plummeted with merciless speed, wiping out fortunes that had taken generations to build. For her husband, the empire he had spent his life creating was reduced to rubble overnight. For her, the glittering world of society turned to ashes. The mansion that had once been alive with laughter, music, and midnight feasts became silent and hollow. Servants departed one by one as wages could no longer be paid. Rooms that once glowed with candlelight now stood in darkness. The carriages that carried her to operas and society balls were sold to cover debts. The woman who had once ruled the ballroom now sat alone in her drawing room, staring at portraits of her youth, wondering how it had all slipped away so quickly. Pride would not let her admit defeat. She still tried to hold her head high when she walked the streets of Fifth Avenue, but whispers followed her. Old friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. Former admirers turned their eyes away, embarrassed by her decline. The invitations that once flooded her doorstep stopped arriving. Society, which had once worshipped her, now cast her aside like a relic of a forgotten age. This betrayal by fortune and by her peers gnawed at her spirit. As the months of ruin stretched into years, her mind began to crack under the weight of despair. She wandered the empty halls of her once grand mansion, speaking to the ghosts of a past life, convincing herself that the parties were still happening, that the music still played, that the chandeliers still sparkled above her. To the outside world, it was madness. But to her, it was the only way to keep the golden age alive. The breaking point came quietly. She withdrew completely from the world. Curtains were drawn shut, doors locked, and her once beautiful face was hidden from the public eye. She became a shadow in her own home, a prisoner of memories she could not let go of. Newspapers whispered about her decline, calling her a tragic reminder of the dangers of wealth built on unstable foundations. She had once been the brightest jewel in New York's crown, and now she was its most sorrowful ghost. In the end, her story was not one of money but of fragility. She had lived her whole life in golden light, never preparing for the shadows. And when the shadows came, she could not escape them. Her tragedy reminds us that the Gilded Age was never just about fortunes made, but also about fortunes lost, and the human cost of dreams shattered in the pursuit of wealth. This was the breaking point, the fall of a woman who had everything, and then lost it all, not just her fortune, but her very mind. The Gilded Age glittered with promises of endless possibility. It was a time when fortunes were made overnight, when the wealthy built grand mansions along Fifth Avenue, and when society was ruled not only by money but by appearances. To belong meant everything. To fall meant exile. For our socialite, once the brightest jewel in New York's crown, the fall came swift and merciless. She had once been adored, her presence commanding every ballroom, every opera box, every lavish garden party. She wore gowns from Paris, diamonds that shimmered like starlight, and a confidence that convinced others she was untouchable. But wealth, fragile as glass, shattered beneath the weight of scandal and ruin. And with its loss came something even more devastating, the loss of belonging. Society's doors closed quietly but firmly. Invitations that had once arrived daily ceased altogether. The carriages that had once lined up at her townhouse stopped coming. Her so-called friends, the ones who had dined at her table and danced in her gilded halls, simply disappeared. In their eyes, she no longer existed. At first, she fought to maintain appearances. She clung to the rituals of her old life, dressing for dinners that never happened, waiting for callers who never arrived. But gradually, the truth seeped into every corner of her existence. The applause had stopped. The admiration was gone. What remained was silence. That silence grew heavy. It followed her down empty hallways, haunted her through sleepless nights, and pressed upon her mind like a weight too great to bear. With no society to mirror her identity back to her, she began to lose sight of who she was. The woman who had once commanded every gaze could now barely meet her own reflection. She retreated further from the world. Curtains drawn, doors locked, letters unanswered. Isolation became her only companion. Days passed without distinction, No laughter, no music, no conversation. Only the echo of what had been. But the human mind does not thrive in emptiness. It festers. Memories twisted into obsessions. Regrets replayed endlessly. She began to speak to shadows, to hear voices in the silence, to invent gatherings that no longer existed. Madness did not arrive like a storm. It crept in like fog, slowly swallowing her until there was little left of the dazzling woman she had once been. Her downfall was not written in poverty alone, but in abandonment. For in the Gilded Age, wealth was more than money. It was identity, it was respect, it was survival. Stripped of it, she was invisible. And invisibility drove her inward, into the darkest chambers of her mind. Once the belle of the Gilded Age, she now existed only as a whisper in the forgotten corners of history. Her name, once spoken with admiration, became a cautionary tale. The fragile price of glory, the brutal cost of falling, and the tragic descent from admiration into isolation, and finally, into madness. The Gilded Age was an era of glittering wealth and quiet ruin, a time when fortunes were made overnight and just as quickly lost, when families draped themselves in pearls and satin, yet hid shadows behind the curtains of their great houses. In this world of chandeliers and ballrooms, one woman once stood as the very symbol of grace and privilege. She had everything that society could bestow: title, wealth, beauty, and the adoration of New York's elite. Yet in the heart of the Gilded Age, her life became the ultimate cautionary tale, a tragedy where glamour crumbled into grief, and brilliance dissolved into the dark abyss of madness. Season 8 in this sweeping saga brings us to what can only be called the most fragile chapter of all, the fragile mind. In the beginning, she was unstoppable, a queen of the social frontier. She graced opera houses, summered in Newport, and presided over salons where the most powerful men of industry gathered at her invitation. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, carried the weight of influence. But the frontier of wealth was a treacherous one, just as uncertain as the western frontier being tamed in the very same era. Just as pioneers faced storms, drought, and isolation, so too did the socialite face invisible storms within her gilded world. It began with loss. Whispers of financial strain reached her ears, followed by humiliations at society's grandest gatherings. Old friends turned their faces. Once admiring voices became mocking, and her name, once written in gold upon every invitation list, now appeared only as a subject of scandal in the press. For a woman raised to believe reputation was everything, these blows landed deep. Grief, humiliation, and betrayal became her constant companions. She withdrew from the world she once ruled. Her great mansion, which had once echoed with laughter, music, and crystal glasses raised in endless toasts, became a silent tomb. She wandered its halls at night, speaking softly to the portraits of her ancestors, as if their painted eyes could offer counsel. Servants whispered that she arranged imaginary dinners, complete with candelabras and empty chairs. The once vibrant queen of society was left to preside over ghosts. Her family began to worry, though not with compassion, but with dread of scandal. In the Gilded Age, madness was not seen as illness. It was a shame, a mark to be hidden. Reports spread of sleepless nights, of sudden outbursts that startled her children, of long conversations with people who were no longer alive. Her mind, once sharp enough to match wits with magnates and senators, now betrayed her. Behind locked doors, her suffering deepened. There were nights of pacing until dawn, days when she refused to eat, and moments when reality itself seemed to splinter. She was said to weep over empty rooms, clutching jewels that no longer brought her joy, and reliving in her imagination the grand parties she could never host again. The gilded cage of wealth had become a prison, and inside its bars, her fragile mind began to break. But in the Gilded Age, there was no safe space for a woman unraveling. Doctors spoke in hushed tones of nervous disorders, offering cruel remedies rather than understanding. Society treated her decline not as tragedy but as entertainment. Gossip pages delighted in her absence, speculating where she had gone, while rivals quietly rejoiced that her throne of influence now stood empty. And so she faded, a shadow of her former self, a symbol of how swiftly fortune could turn, and how mercilessly society could abandon its fallen queens. From glittering ballrooms to silent corridors, from dazzling laughter to anguished whispers, her story became one of the era's great tragedies. The Gilded Age was not only about wealth, it was about fragility. The fragile promises of fortune, the fragile loyalties of high society, and, most of all, the fragile human mind that could not endure the crushing weight of both loss and expectation. In the end, her tragedy was not simply that she'd lost her fortune, nor even her place in society. Her tragedy was that she lost herself. This is the story of the frontier of the mind in the Gilded Age, where no riches, no jewels, no palatial mansions could protect a soul from breaking. A fragile mind, hidden behind gilded walls, left to wither in silence. And it is in her silence that we hear the loudest truth, that beneath the chandeliers and diamonds, the Gilded Age was built as much on sorrow as it was on gold. The Gilded Age was an era of grandeur and opulence. It was the age of gilded mansions along Fifth Avenue, dazzling galas filled with pearls and champagne, and fortunes built on steel, oil, and railroads. It was a time when the daughters of old money were paraded in Paris salons, and new-moneyed barons competed to buy their way into society's highest ranks. The frontier had been tamed, cities were rising like steel towers, and America was remaking itself into a world power. But beneath the glittering surface lay shadows, an undercurrent of inequality, unrest, and the fragile cost of keeping up appearances. It is here, in this world of dazzling wealth and unbearable pressure, that we find the story of one woman, an heiress, a socialite, once adored and envied by all, whose name was whispered with reverence in the drawing rooms of New York. She had everything: beauty, fortune, and a place in the gilded hierarchy of American aristocracy. But behind her perfect smile, a storm was gathering. As the years passed, whispers of her instability began to spread. At first, it was subtle: a nervous laugh at the wrong moment, a slip of the tongue in polite company, a refusal to follow the rigid rules of etiquette that bound every woman of her station. But soon, her eccentricities grew harder to hide. She wandered through her vast mansion at night, speaking to portraits as if they were living guests. She began to imagine conspiracies, shadows in every corner, and voices that no one else could hear. In the Gilded Age, society's solution to such behavior was not compassion, nor understanding. Doctors of the time, armed with outdated theories and a rigid sense of morality, declared her unstable. And when a doctor signed a paper, even the richest of women could not resist. Her family, fearful of scandal, desperate to preserve their reputation, made the fateful decision. She was taken away. The journey from her gilded ballroom to the cold gates of the asylum was a descent no society woman ever wished to face. One day, she was draped in silk gowns, her fingers sparkling with diamonds as orchestras played for her entertainment. The next, she was escorted past iron gates, where the sound of music was replaced by the clanging of locks. Inside the sanitarium, her life was stripped bare. Gone were the chandeliers, the fine perfumes, and the lavish dinners. In their place were whitewashed walls, rigid schedules, and the company of women society had abandoned. Some were destitute, others disgraced, and many, like her, were simply misunderstood. The treatments of the age were harsh, often cruel. Ice baths to shock the body into calm. Rest cures that confined her to bed for weeks on end, forbidding reading, writing, or even conversation. Harsh tonics laced with opiates dulled her senses until she could no longer distinguish dream from waking life. To the world outside, she was forgotten. A scandal swept under the rug, a name erased from guest lists, her memory fading like the last note of a waltz. But inside the asylum, she lived on. The once radiant socialite wandered the halls in silence, clutching scraps of fabric as though they were remnants of her former gowns. She whispered to herself about grand parties and glittering chandeliers, reliving in her mind the world she had lost. In her imagination, she was still a queen of society, though her court now existed only in shadows. The frontier spirit that had once built fortunes and cities was nowhere to be found in the asylum. Here, there was no wealth, no influence, only the stark reality of confinement. For a woman who had once held the world in her hands, this was the cruelest fate of all. And so, the story of this Gilded Age socialite becomes more than just a tale of wealth and downfall. It is a reminder of the fragility of the human mind, the brutal expectations placed upon women of that era, and the devastating consequences of a society more concerned with appearances than compassion. Her diamonds were sold. Her name was erased from society columns. And her legacy, once gilded in gold, was locked away behind iron gates. This is the tragic story of a woman who lost everything, her fortune, her freedom, and finally herself, to madness. The Gilded Age was a frontier unlike any other in American history. It was not the dusty trail of cowboys, nor the rugged wilderness of pioneers. Instead, it was a glittering frontier of wealth, privilege, and excess. Mansions rose like palaces along Fifth Avenue, their gilded walls hiding both triumph and ruin. The old families of New York guarded their place in society, while newly rich industrialists, steel magnates, and railroad barons fought their way into the ballroom. It was a world where reputation was currency, and appearances were everything. At the center of this dazzling but fragile society stood a young woman whose name once glittered across every invitation list. She was born into privilege, draped in pearls, her footsteps echoing across marble halls. In her youth, she was hailed as the belle of the season, the embodiment of refinement, grace, and elegance. She waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, her laughter mingling with the music of Strauss, her gowns imported from Paris, her diamonds rivaling royalty. To the world, she seemed untouchable, as radiant as the gaslit chandeliers of Newport. But the Gilded Age, for all its splendor, was built on fragile foundations. Behind the velvet curtains lay rivalries, betrayals, and crushing expectations. For women of her standing, marriage was not merely romance. It was a contract, a consolidation of wealth and power. She married well, so it seemed, but her husband's fortune, like so many in that feverish age of speculation, was swept away by financial disaster. One bad investment, one railroad collapse, one bank failure, and the empire crumbled. Whispers began to follow her like shadows. The invitations that once arrived daily began to slow, then stop. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The dazzling rooms where she had once been adored grew cold and empty. Isolation crept in, silent and suffocating. And then came the loss no diamond could ever replace, the death of her child, an heir she had loved more fiercely than any possession. That grief carved into her spirit like frost, and slowly her mind began to unravel. By the time the new century dawned, she was no longer the radiant queen of the ballroom. Instead, she wandered the corridors of her once grand home, speaking to ghosts that only she could see. Concerned relatives, desperate to contain the scandal, arranged for her to be placed in a private asylum. The newspapers whispered that she had taken ill, but the truth was far darker. Inside the asylum, time seemed to stand still. The outside world roared forward into modernity. Carriages gave way to automobiles. Jazz drifted from hidden clubs. Women marched for the right to vote and won their place in history. But she remained trapped in a twilight of memory, forever caught in the golden glow of a past that no longer existed. She told the nurses that she must return to her mansion, that she was expecting callers, that the Vanderbilts and Astors were waiting for her. She asked for her gowns, her jewels, her invitations. She practiced her curtsies before the mirror, as if preparing for a ball that would never come. The staff pitied her, but pity is a poor substitute for love. Year after year, the seasons passed, the Gilded Age faded into memory, and the Jazz Age rose to take its place. Her name, once printed in bold headlines, was forgotten, replaced by new debutantes and social queens. The marble mansions of her youth fell into decay, sold off, or demolished to make way for skyscrapers. The world that had once crowned her vanished entirely, leaving her stranded, like a ghost wandering the ruins of her own life. By the time she passed away, she was no longer remembered as the radiant socialite she had once been, but as a forgotten patient whose life had dissolved into silence. Yet her story endures as a haunting reminder of the Gilded Age's most tragic truth, that beneath the gold leaf and grandeur lay a brittle world, one where fortunes vanished overnight, reputations shattered, and the pressure of perfection could drive even the brightest stars into madness. Her tale is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of an age, an era when America stood on the frontier of modernity, caught between opulence and despair. The Gilded Age promised immortality through wealth and beauty, but in the end, it gave only the illusion of permanence. The chandeliers went dark, the carriages rusted, the mansions fell silent. All that remains are echoes, echoes of waltzes that once filled the air, and the memory of a woman who had lost everything to madness. The Gilded Age. It was a time of glittering wealth and deep inequality, when America's cities rose with marble mansions, and fortunes were made overnight in railroads, steel, and oil. But while industrialists carved their names into history, another world was being shaped, the dazzling frontier of high society. In New York and Newport, women in satin gowns and diamonds commanded attention like queens. They were the socialites, the grand hostesses who measured their power not in business ventures, but in influence, status, and spectacle. To belong in their world was to ascend into a kingdom of chandeliers, carriages, and whispered reputations. And in this world, one woman stood brighter than the rest. She was the daughter of privilege, raised in the shadow of both wealth and expectation. Her name was spoken in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue with reverence. She hosted balls so elaborate that newspapers printed descriptions of the flowers, the dresses, the music, and even the champagne. She was young, beautiful, and untouchable. But the frontier was not just a land of cowboys and pioneers. The frontier existed in society itself, the uncharted, dangerous edge where ambition and fragility collided. In that frontier of gilded luxury, the price of one mistake, one scandal, could mean exile, and for this glittering socialite, her fall came not from poverty, but from the shadows of her own mind. As the years passed, whispers began to follow her. At first, it was exhaustion, an overwhelmed hostess retreating from her duties. Then it became eccentricity, strange behavior at dinners, moments of silence in crowded rooms, eyes that seemed to drift somewhere else entirely. Soon, the same newspapers that once celebrated her beauty began hinting at instability. In the Gilded Age, where appearances meant everything, madness was the ultimate disgrace. Doctors offered little help beyond confinement. Friends and admirers turned away. And slowly, the woman who had once been the brightest star of society was locked away behind the cold walls of asylums. There, in the endless corridors, she became a ghost. Nurses and patients did not care for her last name, her wealth, her past. Her jewels had been sold, her mansion emptied, her gowns forgotten. She became just another patient, pacing the tiled floors, her mind unraveling piece by piece. Outside, the world moved on. The grand mansions of the Gilded Age gave way to new fortunes and new names. The younger generation of socialites never knew who she had been. The papers stopped printing her image. The great name that once carried power and envy turned to dust, erased by neglect and time. Decades later, her story lived only in fragments, in yellowed newspaper clippings, in faint mentions in memoirs of the era, in whispers of a once great beauty who lost everything to madness. She had become the forgotten face of the Gilded Age, a cautionary tale that even among the chandeliers and gilded staircases, no one was safe from the cruel hand of fate. Season 11, The Forgotten Name, begins with her story. A reminder that behind every glittering ballroom lies a shadow, and behind every crown of diamonds there may be a heart slowly breaking. This is not just the tale of one woman, but of an age itself, the Gilded Age, where wealth and madness dance together, and where a name that once lit the frontier of society could be erased forever. The frontier of American history was never just the dusty plains of cowboys or the gold-rush towns on the edge of the wilderness. For some, the true frontier was the glittering world of high society during the Gilded Age, a time when railroads stitched together a nation, when fortunes were made overnight, and when the wealthy competed not only with money, but with extravagance, elegance, and power. But behind the marble mansions, diamond tiaras, and golden chandeliers, there were tragedies just as haunting as any frontier ghost story. This is the tale of a woman once crowned as a queen of society, whose life began in the dazzling ballrooms of the Gilded Age, but ended in the silent halls of an asylum. A woman who lived as if she were royalty, only to lose everything, her wealth, her status, her mind. The bitter end. She was born into privilege, a daughter of the frontier's richest generation. Her family's wealth came from the roaring ironworks of Pennsylvania, the expanding railroads, and the bold industries that defined the Gilded Age. For her, life was not about survival, but about spectacle. By the time she was 18, she had been presented to society, dressed in Parisian gowns that cost more than most men earned in a year. Chandeliers sparkled above her, while orchestras played waltzes to which she danced effortlessly. Men courted her, women envied her, and newspapers praised her as one of the most beautiful debutantes of her age. She married a man not just wealthy, but ambitious. Together, they built palaces of stone and glass on Fifth Avenue. Their dinners were legendary, banquets were oysters, and champagne flowed endlessly, where European nobility dined beside American tycoons. At a time when the frontier was still pushing westward, she created her own empire on the frontier of social ambition, But beneath the glitter, cracks began to show. The Gilded Age was not built on solid gold, but on fragile illusions. Fortunes that seemed eternal vanished overnight. Railroads collapsed. Banks failed. Business rivals destroyed one another. Her husband, caught in the storms of speculation and scandal, lost much of their fortune. To society, bankruptcy was not merely financial ruin, it was social death. She refused to accept it. Even as debts mounted, she threw grand parties, mortgaging her future for the sake of appearances. Chandeliers still glowed, orchestras still played, and diamonds still flashed in her throat. But those who came whispered about her behind lace-gloved hands. They called her delusional, desperate, unwilling to face reality. And then, tragedy struck harder. Death came to her family, her husband gone, her children scattered, her friends abandoning her one by one. The woman once draped in silk now lived under the weight of unpaid bills and empty halls. Loneliness clawed at her mind. Rumors of strange behavior spread. She spoke to people who weren't there. She wandered the streets at night, convinced her fortune still awaited her return. Doctors of the age, with their crude understanding of the mind, called it madness. Her family, eager to silence scandal, committed her to an institution. For a woman once compared to royalty, it was the ultimate humiliation. Instead of chandeliers, there were iron bars. Instead of champagne, bitter medicine. Instead of applause, silence. Years passed. Her name faded from the society pages. The mansions she once ruled were sold, their marble staircases stripped, their ballrooms empty. The Gilded Age itself came to an end, swept away by the panic of 1893, the Progressive Era, and the new century. But she remained behind, trapped in that asylum, her memory of grandeur fading into shadows. Old age found her there. The princess of the Gilded Age reduced to a patient no one spoke about. Her family rarely visited, too ashamed of the scandal, too eager to forget her. She died quietly, without chandeliers, without music, without the diamonds that had once crowned her. And so ended the life of a woman who had once ruled the frontier of high society. A cautionary tale of ambition, wealth, and the fleeting nature of glory. She lived as if the world itself bent to her will, but in the end, the world forgot her. Her fortune, her fame, her very sanity, lost to the merciless tides of history. This is the tragedy of the Gilded Age socialite who lost everything to madness. A story not of cowboys or pioneers, but of the frontier of wealth itself, where fortunes were made, reputations destroyed, and lives consumed in the relentless pursuit of glittering dreams. Season 12. The Bitter End. The Gilded Age. It was a time of glittering wealth and boundless ambition, when New York's Fifth Avenue was lined with palaces built not of stone, but of ego and fortune. The railroads stretched like veins across a young nation, oil barons and steel magnates raised empires, and names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Carnegie stood as symbols of power. Yet beneath this golden surface, there was a darker story, of fragility, of broken dreams, and of lives that crumbled into silence. Our story begins with one of the era's most radiant socialites. She was born into a family of means, her name whispered in the same drawing rooms as the great dynasties. From the moment she stepped into society, she seemed destined for greatness. Her beauty was legendary, her gowns imported from Paris, her jewels dazzling under the gaslit chandeliers of the grandest ballrooms. To be in her company was to touch the very peak of the Gilded Age dream. She hosted banquets where senators and tycoons dined under ceilings painted with cherubs, where orchestras played into the night, and where whispers of her charm and wit followed her everywhere. To the outside world, she was untouchable, a queen of high society. But the Gilded Age was not only about riches, it was about appearances. Behind the silks and diamonds, the cracks in her world began to show. Her family's fortune, tied to speculative investments on the frontier, began to falter. The same West that promised opportunity, the railroads stretching into endless plains, the oil wells springing from the earth, the mines glittering with silver, was also a frontier of risk. The empire her family had built on uncertain ground started to crumble. The parties grew quieter, the invitations fewer, the creditors louder. Society, so quick to elevate its darlings, was just as quick to abandon them when the shine wore off. Friends who once toasted her with champagne now turned their backs. It was then, in the silence of her empty mansion, that her mind began to fray. Newspapers, always eager for scandal, began to report rumors of her decline. They said she wandered her gilded halls at night speaking to the ghosts of her past. They said she clutched her pearls in trembling hands, convinced that voices whispered from the walls. The same society that once praised her beauty now mocked her tragedy. By the dawn of the new century, she was gone from the public eye. The mansion was sold, her jewels auctioned, her gowns scattered. She was confined to a private asylum, her name no longer printed in the society pages, but scribbled in hospital ledgers. The woman who had once symbolized the splendor of the Gilded Age became its most haunting cautionary tale. Season 13 we call the frontier of memory, for memory itself is a kind of frontier, vast, uncharted, and often unforgiving. And it is memory that rescued her from complete erasure. Decades later, historians pieced together her life. They wrote not only of her glamour, but of her downfall. They saw in her story a mirror of the Gilded Age itself, a time of towering fortunes and devastating collapses, a time where progress marched forward but human hearts were often left behind. She became more than just a tragic figure. She became a symbol of how fragile wealth and social status truly are, how quickly fortunes turn to dust. In her life and in her madness, she reminded us that the Gilded Age was not only a story of gold, but also of shadows, and so, as history remembers her, she lives again, not in the glitter of chandeliers, but in the haunting truth that behind every golden facade, there may be a frontier of sorrow waiting quietly in the dark. The story begins in the late 19th century, during what historians call the Gilded Age, a time when America seemed wrapped in gold. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue in New York, filled with chandeliers, glittering gowns, and soirees that stretched long into the night. The elite dined on imported delicacies, while orchestras played, their wealth on full display in every polished surface and every diamond clasped to a wrist. To the world, it appeared to be an age of boundless prosperity and opportunity. But beneath the glitter, shadows always linger. The Gilded Age was not only a story of fortune, but also of fragility. It was an era where the frontier was still shaping the soul of America. As settlers pushed westward in search of freedom, land, and new beginnings, those who remained in the great cities often lived in pursuit of something else: status, wealth, and eternal recognition. Our story belongs to one woman, an heiress, a beauty, a socialite who stood at the very pinnacle of this glittering society. She was born into privilege, her family's fortune made in railroads and steel. From the moment she entered society, she was destined for fame. Newspapers chronicled her gowns, her carriages, her attendance at balls. She was the embodiment of the Gilded Age ideal: elegance without limits, wealth without question, and beauty that seemed untouchable. But behind the carefully polished facade, her world was not as secure as it appeared. She had grown up in a home where money mattered more than affection, where alliances were forged not by love, but by contracts, mergers, and marriages of convenience. Her heart longed for something more, for meaning, for connection, for freedom. In a strange way, she yearned for the spirit of the frontier, the untamed land where life was harsh but real, where people struggled and built something enduring out of nothing. Her tragedy began with choices. She married for wealth, not love, to a man who matched her family's ambition but not her heart. The mansion they built was vast, filled with rooms she wandered through alone. Parties masked her loneliness, jewels glittered on her wrist, but weighed heavily on her spirit. Slowly, what the world saw as triumph became, for her, a gilded cage. The pressures of society grew unbearable. Every rival sought to outshine her. Every gossip column twisted her words. Every smile she offered became another mask she was forced to wear. She slipped into isolation, her brilliance dimmed by whispers and judgments. In that silence, madness crept in, not as sudden lightning, but as a slow and consuming storm. Doctors of the day, with their limited understanding, prescribed rest cures that confined her to her bedroom, cutting her off from the very human contact she craved. Instead of healing, the isolation deepened her despair. Her journals, once filled with plans for charity and reform, began to darken with scattered thoughts, broken phrases, and cries for freedom. By the end of her life, the woman who once embodied the very height of society had lost everything. Her fortune was squandered in lawsuits and betrayals. Her friends, eager to preserve their own reputations, drifted away. The grand mansion stood like a tombstone to her memory, while she herself slipped into obscurity, her mind fractured, her name whispered only as a cautionary tale. Yet, her story is not only about sorrow. It carries with it a powerful lesson, one that echoes through history. For in setting the historical context of her life, the frontier itself becomes the backdrop and the metaphor. The frontier represented resilience, struggle, and the pursuit of something real and enduring. It stood as the opposite of the hollow glitter of Gilded Age society. The lesson of the frontier is this: wealth without grounding, ambition without compassion, and beauty without love cannot sustain the human spirit. Just as pioneers needed grit, courage, and community to survive the wilderness, so too must we cultivate balance and resilience to survive the wilderness of ambition and excess. Her tragic story reminds us of the true cost of a life lived only for appearances. Behind every mansion there may be sorrow. Behind every glittering diamond may hide a heart that is breaking. And behind every fortune lies a choice, whether to use it for vanity or to build something lasting. The Gilded Age dazzled with its excess, but it also revealed its emptiness. And the life of this forgotten socialite, who lost everything to madness, still speaks to us today. It warns us not to be consumed by what glitters, but to hold fast to what endures: human connection, compassion, and resilience. That is the true lesson of the frontier, and the haunting legacy of one woman's fall from grace.